Well, hi everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Feeling Smarter. As always, I'm joined by Tim Miller. G'day, Tim. How are you?
Yeah, going pretty well, Aaron. How are you doing?
Not too bad, thank you. Well, as we continue on in our discussions around property in SMSFs, naturally we have our upcoming SMSF Property Masterclass. We're going to dive this week into the use of limited recourse borrowing arrangements. And Tim, we could talk for probably a whole day on this topic if we really needed to, because there are so many elements to the utilisation of LRBAs. But we'll really, I guess, drill down in today's discussion in the structuring component anyway around the acquisition of those assets and I guess the use of the bare trust structure. So to kick things off, I guess to you is what are some of the important elements that we need to contemplate here when we utilise an LRBA to acquire property?
Yeah, look, I guess probably for me, Aaron, one of the first things that we have to clearly identify is that we have this prohibition on borrowing inside the SIS Act, and so we're then sort of bound by the exceptions to those prohibition rules, and most of those prohibition exceptions are relatively limiting in what you can actually do, with the exception then of 67A, which provides us with the capacity to acquire what they classify as a single acquirable asset, so long as that asset is then held on trust, with the capacity for the ownership to be transferred to the self-managed super fund on payment of the borrowings, on final payment of the borrowing. So there's a couple of key issues there. One is this concept of single acquirable asset, and that is certainly a very long conversation. But then this concept there that the asset is held on trust, so it is effectively under a separate ownership structure to the self-managed superannuation fund. And then without going too far down the rabbit warren, of course, what that means is we've got effectively an investment in a trust from an SMSF point of view, which we then have to look closely at our in-house asset rules and our in-house asset exceptions, where we have a specific exception to the in-house asset definition, which is an investment that is held on trust in accordance with effectively Section 67A from a borrowing point of view.
Yeah, so yeah, there's a fair bit to unpack even just in that with what you summarised there. But ultimately, we have therefore seen the ATO come out and provide some very clear guidance on what is three key areas around the use of LRBA. So the single acquirable asset that you just touched on. And then, of course, it goes in and looks at improvements versus repairs and maintenance. And then there's what we call the creation of a different asset. So let's focus, I guess, in the first instance on that single acquirable asset concept, because it is an area that, as you, I guess, touched on at the very beginning as well, it's not just looking at the asset in isolation. You made reference to a collection of identical assets, and we can have circumstances whereby there may be multiple titles, but you can actually aggregate those together under the single acquirable asset definition.
Yeah, and I guess that's where the difficulty arises, is that concept of can you split a title, for example, versus do you want to split a title? And this is where the ATO get quite specific, in the sense that, if there's an encumbrance to suggest that you can't split an investment, then it would be classified, if there's multiple titles, to be a single acquirable asset. Whereas if there's no encumbrance and you just choose to sell it as one asset, that won't necessarily define it as a single acquirable asset, which would potentially result in you requiring multiple limited recourse borrowing arrangements, which then gets quite clunky.
Yeah, and we see that quite often in packages with property, apartments, and then there might be the ancillary car park or something that goes with it, that you do then need to look at how the contract is structured, and then making sure that maybe that car park needs to be unpacked and dealt with separately, because that ultimately wouldn't meet the single acquirable asset definition. So there's a lot of nuances, I guess, in respect to the way in which that definition would be applied.
Yeah, certainly. And of course, the one that we often get caught talking about is primary production land, which is inevitably split over multiple titles, and then it's really about well, can they actually be separated or not? And it will often come down to, what buildings have you got across them, and what infrastructure, what other infrastructure exists that restricts your capacity to separate those packages of land.
Yeah. And I guess just touching on some of those other elements, and I call it the LRBA Bible, it's the SMSF ruling in 2012/1. And it'd be fair to say it's probably the most practical SMSF ruling that we've got, the way that the examples are derived and so forth. But what are some of the other intricacies that we need to deal with when we think about repairs and maintenance and then versus improvements in the context of LRBAs? Because again, we need to look at these very differently when we think about it in an income tax perspective, for example.
Yeah, and look, it's quite an interesting area because what that ruling is very clear on, and the way that the legislation is drafted is that the amount that you borrow to acquire the asset can actually incorporate amounts that are used for repairs and maintenance. So you really do need to have that allowance built into the original loan documentation, so redraw facilities in there, but you can use that for repairs and maintenance. And the ruling, as you suggest, provides some pretty good practical examples on what would be considered repairs and maintenance versus improvements, because the key issue is that you can't borrow or use borrowed monies to improve an asset. So whilst the fund could use its existing capital or additional capital to potentially improve an asset, it can't use borrowed monies, nor can you actually change the nature of the asset by those improvements. Because if you change the nature of the investment, then you've got a different asset, and that then is in breach of the Section 67A rules.
Yeah, which is really that third limb that I was talking about there, is that it needs to retain the format, for sake of a better word, to what it was originally acquired. And this is where it becomes interesting in property, because you do see people going, oh, maybe it would be good to subdivide that land. And so therefore the character of that asset has become different to what it was originally acquired. And we see house and land is a very good example of that as well. People may be buying a block and then wanting to do something with it. You've really got to go back to, well, what was it originally acquired for? And have you fundamentally changed the character? So has it converted from residential to commercial or vice versa? Have you gone from one block to multiple blocks? So it's the characteristics of that become crucial in determining whether you continue to comply with those elements in 67A and B.
Yeah, that's right. And one of the key issues, I guess, with that, Aaron, as well, is that because we hold this investment on trust as such, one of the key issues becomes to retain or maintain that in-house asset exemption. The question is often raised as to the ability or the desire or the need to transfer the asset out of the trust following the repayment of the loan. Now, in a practical sense, it's not a requirement to do that. So you can retain that asset in effectively the holding trust, for want of a better term there. However, if you then ever want to improve that asset or make those changes that we discuss, then that would effectively create a breach of those requirements, because it's still an asset subject to the terms of a limited recourse borrowing arrangement. So it would make sense, if you're wanting to change the nature of the investment, to move it back to the trustees of the self-managed super fund upon repayment.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess we've been able to talk there non-stop and probably just take one breath in between us. So there's plenty that naturally we could talk about around the use of LRBAs. And of course, our upcoming SMSF Property Masterclass is going to go into these areas and much more. So Tim, I guess any final comments from you as we look ahead to our masterclass on the 4th of June, where we're going to focus on property, including the use of LRBAs?
I guess what I'm going to say, Aaron, is that all of these subject matters that we've spoken about today, I've incorporated into the case study and the activities. So we'll be able to do a deep dive into how all of those issues impact property investments in an SMSF.
Excellent. Well, thank you once again. Great to catch up, and we'll see you in person next week for our weekly video.
Looking forward to it. See you then.
Excellent. Bye for now.